Hey everybody, welcome back to Volvara Part 3. In this video I'm working on mostly a dome for the island, but before I do that, I'm gonna be adding some smaller things around the front here, or the back. I'm not actually sure which side of the island is which, but some of the smaller things which I haven't got so far on the bottom of the island, just to start cleaning up that stuff already. I'm not entirely sure what I'm gonna do on the bottom of the island to make sure that it stays in the air. I might put some propellers down there, or I might put some like air bubbles in there. We'll see whatever I can do with that, but at first I just want to clean up the sort of messy spots that I left over here before I get into the dome building, which, as a fair warning at the beginning of this video, while we are still freshly into this video, I do want to say that I took about, well over 15 minutes to make the dome, and that is even with parts cut out, so it's going to be a pretty slow-paced part. It's definitely going to be the outlandish and overly detailed and slow-paced kind of building that I was talking about at the beginning of this series, so that's something to, I suppose, prepare for. Just keep in mind that there's not going to be happening too much in this video, but my focus is really, again, on getting all of the details in and experimenting a lot with the different pieces that we have. And so over here I'm just kind of cleaning up everything, making sure that if I leave this part of the island behind, there aren't any messy bits or open bits which kind of look unfinished and rough. So one of the things that I was very concerned about was how to actually control the enormous gear which I have over here. Because the issue with making this island in general is that there are so many different parts which should be moving and which are going through each other. We have the coaster track moving through a lot of the building, we have the enormous gear which basically disrupts any kind of fluid building that you want to have throughout that area. And I wanted to make sure that I have these parts where these different moving parts can basically go through each other without too much friction, so I'm building that quick trench for the gear to go through, and that'll also be sort of cutting through a building as well. And over here underneath the coaster, I wanted to support the flying propeller tower that I have with a arch that juts out from the rest of the building, so that the lift hill supports are still mostly visible and I don't end up putting the building and the coaster too close to each other. But still, it looks somewhat alright, I suppose. I also wanted to get something that, you know, connects the propeller tower to the rest of the building and to the ground, so that it isn't floating by itself, while at the same time making something that's lightweight enough that it doesn't form this enormous wall, meaning that you can't see the rest of it. Which is basically why I wanted to choose this arch piece. And then for sort of the foundation of that, I decided to put this little slope over here, which kind of follows the curve of the island. That's definitely something that I want to do with the rest of these buildings as well. I do want to leave some of the island visible, so there will be some sort of trees here and there, a little bit of foliage, but also some of these parts where the walls just kind of go along with the shape of the island, so not everything is flat and static and boring. And instead, even the downside of the building should be interesting to look at, I figured. And much like an interesting foundation or podium for a building, I did want to give these slightly different textures. So whereas I am hoping to have most of the building's top parts all use this very light brick texture and very light tones in general, I want to make sure that the foundation parts have much more dark tones. So I'm using many of the same pieces over here, just in darker shades of brown. And again, I do kind of mix up the different shades to make everything stand out a little bit from each other. The only thing that I'm still concerned with, and this is something which, you know, I'm not really too sure yet how it's going to work out, because the island is so vastly unfinished and there isn't any foliage or anything yet in there. But the one thing that I'm very concerned about and not sure how it's going to work out is really the color scheme, in a sense that it's very brownish, it's very gritty, and of course that's part of the steampunk aesthetic as well, in a sense, but it almost feels like it's too colorless, like everything is very toned down and blend, and that's something that I do want to avoid, and I'm not really sure how, because so far I do have many of the same shades of brown. Only way in which I kind of want to counteract that is having these super dark spots. Like have some of these elements, like the weird random steam machine over here, which ideally, the idea would be that this is, you know, the bottom of the gear, this is where it powers the gear, because the gear, kind of like the Ferris wheel that is built around the Thunderdome, what's it called again? Thunder Dolphin in Tokyo, which is super interesting. It's a Ferris wheel that doesn't actually have any supports, it's just completely supported by the lower part of it. Saying that it doesn't have any supports is kind of, yeah, that's kind of a misconception, I suppose. It is of course supported, it isn't floating, but it's a Ferris wheel without any spokes, and Thunder Dolphin, the roller coaster, goes straight through it, and what it does is it kind of holds up the Ferris wheel and just pretty much controls the entire thing from down at the ground level. And that's kind of what I'm doing with this gear. That's an overly ridiculous explanation, could have been perhaps a bit easier, but if you didn't know about the Ferris wheel yet, you should totally check it out, because it is awesome, and it's actually what one of the in-game Ferris wheels is based on. But anyway, that's why I wanted to have that machine down there at the gear. And my original point was that, yeah, I wanted to have some of these very dark colors here and there. So some of these spots do have some super dark brown or even black little elements to hopefully make everything a bit more contrasting and not too blurry. But I'm not sure how well that's really going to work out in the end. I suppose we'll see once everything is done. Anyway, that was all I wanted to do for the small details. Now moving on, I am finally starting work on the dome. And I'm gonna have to fill 15 minutes for this. So we'll see how that's gonna go. I suppose a very good point to talk about now that we're still making the very beginnings of the dome is what my inspirations were. Because my inspirations were very crucial in how I made the outline of the dome, and that in turn was very crucial to how it looks in the end, of course. So yeah, this is a pretty interesting thing. Basically, my first initial inspiration was what else? The St. Peter's Basilica dome in Vatican City, which is absolutely beautiful and has definitely been an inspiration for many domes around the world. But also there is the beautiful marble church in Copenhagen, which has a similar dome, just with different elements, that I thought was a very good kind of reference, not really a reference in any way, but a good kind of estimate of the kind of thing that I was going for. This is going to be a very large dome, very dominating, and much like those two domes, have all of these pillars on the side, have a bunch of windows on top of the dome, and a pretty large cupola on top of it. So that's really why they were such big inspirations. In terms of many details though, I am not really doing what either of them are doing, and in terms of color, that is definitely not the case. I started out with this green copper-ish color, hoping that I could turn this into an interesting green copper dome. In the end, I did skip that idea though, because it doesn't really fit in with the red roofs that I have for the rest of the castle. I was originally thinking that this green dome would be able to add some more color to the otherwise just using warm colors castle, so kind of offset the large amount of reds and browns that the castle has so far, but I think in the end it just doesn't really work that well. I'm just a bigger fan of this dome with a red roof, so I changed it to red in the end. But that's not really a big deal. The basic shape of the roof, or of the dome, is basically like this, and the shape is really just derived from St. Peter's. And the same kind of goes for the idea to add these little windows in here, though you see those in domes very often. In terms of the design though, they are a bit interesting, just a bunch of improvisation with the new pieces that we have. I am super glad that we have all of these new pieces, because while I'm not really messing around with them too much, this is my first time opening the park file of Volvara with the Christmas pieces, and some of the gingerbread pieces are super good for ironwork, and that's something which I really missed in some of the later episodes, or some of the earlier episodes. I mean, I remember in episode 1 and 2 I would have to sink like signs and things like that into walls in very like ridiculous ways to end up with that little part of ironwork at the end of the object that I would use for my own ironwork. But in this case, making these gingerbread pieces black is just a beautiful way to use to make your own ironwork basically, and using them in a sort of beige kind of color kind of works as stone decorative elements as well. Definitely has a bit of an Art Nouveau vibe to me as well. So that was just what I was experimenting with at this point. Nothing too good or anything, just really randomly trying these objects on the windows and seeing how it would look. But it's just those little very small decorative elements that do add a bit of flair to buildings and definitely make them a bit more unique, because of course not every building is going to be exactly the same in details, even if it is the same in general layout. So I think these smaller pieces are really what you can make different buildings in Planet Coaster more unique with and stand out with more. Now for the ridges of the dome, I sort of had a couple of versions of this, as you might be able to tell. My first version was just simple pillars. That didn't work out too well. So then I went to some of the smaller concrete beige-ish pillars, but still those felt very thick. And so in the end I was looking for more of a connection with the red roof and a way to make these ridges look less thick and put more of a focus on the color of the roof itself. And in the end, the way that I try to achieve that is by just putting these red decorative elements on the side of these. And that is basically that. They are some of the things that brought the amount of objects in this building up to some quite ridiculous heights, since in the end, the dome alone, I think, has somewhere up to like 6,000 or 8,000 pieces. Something like this. It's not very good for my computer, that's for sure, but that's why I'm doing this in a separate park file anyway. But it's not very user-friendly, I would say, and it's definitely not something that I can even think about uploading to the workshop, sadly. And so the dome part of the dome, that sounds weird, is pretty much finished at this point, and I wanted to get to some of the sides where I wasn't too sure how to approach this. There are definitely different ways. I just wanted to have like some sort of cornices at the top part, and then just a very wide part without anything in it, just decorative elements, and then underneath that some pillars that hold up the rest of the dome. So here I'm just adding sort of like the wide decorative and cornice parts. And one of the things which I thought was kind of funny is I wanted to get some of these draped clothing parts that you often see on the classical buildings. It's, well, a very classical piece. But there isn't any such piece in the game. There are some of these pieces for actual clothing, but of course I needed them to be cut out of stone in this case. So I just took a door and a bunch of Christmas decorations, and that kind of looks like it, especially from a distance. I suppose it gets the idea across. And then I wanted to get to some of these small spire parts, and I figured why not do the spire of the propeller tower very quickly, because we do have these new Christmas, what do they call them, baubles, I believe. That was probably the worst pronunciation ever. I did check all of the comments when I talked about the word earlier in my Christmas series, but I didn't actually look up how to pronounce the word, so thank you for everybody who left a suggestion for how I should pronounce it though. I hope that was okay. But anyway, I put some of those on top because as great as they can be in Christmas trees, it's when you color these things and give them a different purpose is when they really shine, I think, especially on some of these very small decorative elements. And then to make the piece which rests on top of the pillars, and I did have to do a bunch of try and error with this piece, because while the piece itself is very simple, it's just a part of, well, what you see on many friezes in classical architecture, just very large in this case. The only problem that I had with this is that I wasn't really sure how much I wanted the pillars to stick out from the rest of the dome. Because for St. Peter's Basilica, for instance, the pillars stick out from the dome a lot. Like they really make the building appear a lot wider. But in many cases, the pillars are more like pilasters, and they're just kind of tucked into the wall and don't actually make the building wider at all. And so at first I tried to make these like pillars that really stick out from the building and have this part come out and make it a lot wider. And in the end I did have to experiment a bit with how much I wanted this part to stick out for the proportions of the building to still make sense. But the basic premise is fairly simple. They're kind of like custom pillars. because the game doesn't actually have any round pillars that you can make yourself, which makes a lot of sense. The pillars in the game are very easy to use, but in this case I was looking for an exact color and texture that I was looking for. So I put a bunch of square pillars together, rotated them until they were round, which is actually a good thing because pillars, especially Corinthian pillars like these, have deep ridges. So dragging a pillar around to make a round pillar out of a square pillar kind of gives you those ridges that you want to have in a classical pillar. So I've got that, and then some of the regular crowns that you see, except also kind of rotated to make them a bit more round. And that's really the pillars. They're one of my favorite things. I know this isn't the first time I've used them, but it's the first time that I've actually talked about them and talked a bit about how I make them. They're just some of my favorite things because even though they might not be too great on your object count, for the pillars you're just using rectangles, so that really doesn't add too much to your lag of the game, I believe. Shouldn't be too much of an issue, plus you're not placing too many of them either. But it gives you a lot more control over how your pillars look, how tall they are, what kind of colors they have. So that's something that I really love doing. Now as for the final part of this video, which is making the cupola on top of the dome, this is something that I struggled with quite a bit. Since so far the dome was really just built on some dimensions that I set at the very beginning of the video, where if I copy around this dome, it's gonna seamlessly fit into each other to have this one section become the entire dome all the way around. But for the cupola, I had no idea like what to make the dimensions out of to make sure that I could copy paste it, make it go around and turn it into a full dome. So at this point it was a bit of trial and error to get this thing in the right position. But the basic premise of the thing itself is just very similar to the dome, except at a very small scale. I made some extra small pillars over here. I had to make my own crowns for these though, because the in-game ones are super small, so I decided to pick a bunch of cornices, not too many, but just a fair amount that it looks like a Corinthian crown with all of these leaves sticking out from it. So yeah, I took a bunch of those and made my own ones, which are a little bit smaller than the in-game ones and definitely have the round shape that I was looking for. But then when I was copying it around, I found that the dimensions were completely off and basically meant that I would fill in the entire thing with just pillars and no open space between that. So I sort of had to rethink my plans at this point. I thought for a second to kind of do it like this, where I have separate pillars, but I wasn't really too happy with how that looked either, since the rest of the pillars on here are all double pillars. So in the end what I did is I made the piece of dome that I already have underneath here twice as wide, so that I have to copy paste 2 times less of these things to make the full dome, which means that I have twice the amount of width to mess around with the small cupola over here, if that makes any sense. Basically it means that I can put these 2 pillars next to each other and all the dimensions are going to work out right, and the space between the pillars is going to be just a little bit more than the space that the pillars themselves take in. So that's all fair, and at that point I was pretty confident to go into the top part of this thing here, which again kind of mimics the bottom part of the dome. Wanted to make sure that at least it's somewhat similar. And whether these things have like a pointy roof or a very small dome roof, I don't think it really matters too much, but what I did want to make sure was that the top part of the cupola here is very tall, that it really is kind of like a vertical accent. So what I decided to do in the end is sort of put like a mini cupola on top of it again, and have that be topped off by a very small spire, which is just going to be pyramid shaped ish, except with 8 sides. I'm not sure what the mathematical name for that is. And instead of that idea which I tried earlier, which is just a solid roof, I decided to make this actually fit in with the main tower of the building, actually keep some themes that repeat throughout the build. So I decided to make it out of the same wooden posts that I made the top part of the tower out of, which is like the tallest and main tower of the building, which kind of has that like Eiffel Tower-ish part. So now we have this sort of brown rusted-ish metal looking part on top of the dome, and that's something which I'm quite happy with. It's not the best looking thing, but it's a way to keep that theme repeating throughout the build and make it fit in a little bit more with the rest of the build, because oh wow, that was the weirdest pronunciation of build ever. But the rest of this entire thing already has a lot of these steampunk, gritty, industrial like elements. Like the main tower has all of these pipes and stuff coming out. There are a few gears here and there. There's definitely some machinery and steam engines around the island, but this dome has none of that stuff. At least not yet. So that's something that kind of breaks away from the rest of the theme of the island, and that's something that I'll definitely have to figure out how to deal with that at some point in the future. I just didn't want to end up ruining this dome, so what I'll most likely end up doing to make it fit in a bit more is, for one, my plan for the next episode is to build a enormous clock, custom made, to give it kind of a clockpunk idea in there and put it into the steampunk theme a bit more. Lots of opportunities for ironwork over there as well. I know maybe we will put some cables and pipes on the side of this dome and decorate it. In this episode, I just wanted to get the dome itself in. And so to top it off here, I just quickly made the spire part, and now we can copy the entire dome together as a big test to see how this thing is working, and in the end it all connects beautifully, and that is basically it. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.